Welcome to the South Australian Drought Hub podcast, strengthening drought resilience for our farmers and regional communities.
Frost. It's a curse that many farmers face. Estimates are that it causes $400 million worth of damage to wheat growers alone each year. So, what can be done to reduce these considerable losses? G'day, I'm Drew Radford, and in South Australia, a recent project has focused on answering that question. It's called Understanding Frost and Minimising Financial Risk Due to Frost in the Mid-North High Rainfall Zone. Central to it has been Mick Faulkner. He's owner of AgriLink Agricultural Consultants and also member of the Mid-North High Rainfall Zone Farming Systems Group. G'day, Mick.
G'day, Drew. How are you today?
Mick, I'm fantastic, thanks. And it's good to be speaking to you about this frost project. You've done some significant work with it. There's a few people involved and it's got a bit of a long title.
It does have a long title. It's really about how to minimise the financial risk. To do that, we have to understand frost and then try and put practices into place to minimise the financial risk due to frost. It is in the Mid-North, and it's with the Mid-North High Rainfall Zone group who have an emphasis on frost in their projects and for the benefit of their members. So it's a Drought Hub, Mid-North High Rainfall Zone and AgriLink have joined forces for this project.
Now, Mick, the impetus for the project, can you set the scene for me a little bit? Because many growers are asking, are we having more frosts than we've ever had before?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I think there's no doubt the impact of frost is probably greater than what we've seen, and the work done by Stephen Crimp would suggest that the frost season has expanded over the last 20 years. So the damaging frosts are starting a little bit earlier in spring and persisting a little bit later in spring. But on top of that, we've changed what we're doing on farm. For example, if we take some of the wheat varieties we used, we've made that move to shorter season wheats, and that's because they're performing well in most seasons. We've got rid of a lot of the impediments that we had to cropping bigger areas. So whereas our parents might have had the bottom paddock that they ran sheep or cattle on, we've said for the sake of efficiency, we're going to take the fences out and we're going to incorporate that into another paddock. And we tend to do the same thing on all parts of that paddock or all parts of the same rotation on a farm. There's also some other things that have happened, Drew. We've increased the amount of stubble retention for all the right reasons, but that has a direct impact on our frost susceptibility because it introduces higher levels of ice-nucleating bacteria into the system, and it's the ice-nucleating bacteria that do exactly what they say they're going to do. They make ice nucleate because low temperatures on their own don't mean much. They're not going to do any harm. It's only when ice is produced that we actually get this freezing damage.
So there's a bit going on there. So where was the project based?
Okay, the project was centred at Farrell Flat. So Farrell Flat has an elevation that it does have very, very cold weather and is very frost prone. So we had our site on the valley floor about 3 kilometres south of Farrell Flat, and we had numerous frosts. We had over 50 frosts for the year. What would be technically described as frost due to temperature. It doesn't mean there was ice formed on every one of those frosts or there was freezing damage, but technically due to the temperature it was received, we had many, many frosts.
Mick, you alluded to this a moment ago in terms of the change of farming practices. You've mentioned the general location, Farrell Flat, but you were talking a moment ago about we've changed the farming practices in terms of making monster-sized paddocks. That's going to change, I'd imagine, where you get frost across one farm.
It certainly does. So where previous generations might have said, oh, well, that's a very frost-prone area, we often get damage there and it hurts when we get damaged, they might have had that paddock running livestock, but the livestock have disappeared off a lot of farms. But those areas still remain, and we've just taken the fences out. So I would call those areas where there is significant damage either in any one year that we get a hell of a wipeout or we get some sort of damage almost every year. I would call them a red zone, so a frost red zone. When we get up to the tops of the hills, we may never experience a frost there. That's what I would call a green zone. The area in between is an amber zone. The other thing about the green zone is there are many, many areas of South Australia where farmers don't have a significant frost risk. So their whole farm is basically a green zone. They might get a little bit of damage here and there, but nothing significant. Now, you wouldn't want to reduce your profitability on those green zones by adopting anything that might work on a red zone. Conversely, you wouldn't want to take what works on a green zone down into a red zone because it probably increases your risk. So things like full stubble retention, things like frost-susceptible crops, it doesn't matter if we grow them on the green zone, but when we take them down into the red zone, we increase that risk. Now, the total risk, it depends on what percentage of your farm is green zone and what percentage is red zone, and that bit in the middle is the amber zone, remember? If I have the majority of my farm as a green or amber zone, I don't have a significant risk and I can probably wear it financially. But as my percentage area of red zone increases, so does the risk of financial loss. And I have to farm differently on my red zones versus my green zones.
Mick, that zoning is really important to understand. Beyond there then, what were the broad brush objectives of the project?
The broad brush objectives are to manage that risk as well as we possibly can. So we acknowledge right from the start that everyone that listens to this podcast or has been involved in the project has a different level of risk, and we wouldn't want to put them all in the same bundle. So that someone who has a high risk, because they have a large percentage of red zone, they will need a different message than someone who has a smaller percentage of their farm as a red zone. And they may accept slightly lower productivity simply to reduce the risk of failure. It's the risk of failure that has the biggest financial impact.
So, Mick, what were the high-level objectives of the project? I understand that there were three aspects that were focused upon.
The first one of those is what can we do to avoid frosts? If we know when the frosts are going to occur or have a reasonable expectation of when the frosts are going to occur, then maybe we can have the sensitive stage before the period of frost or more likely after the period of frost. Now, the danger with doing it afterwards, having that sensitive period, and let's say we use flowering, not entirely accurate, but we use that. If we flower after we think the last frost is going to be, we might avoid frost, but we also run the risk of more loss to drought and heat. But it can be successful, and the success of it depends a lot on elevation. The second, we could grow something that is way out of season. Last year we looked at Super High Lake safflower because flowering generally in the mid-north is in early December, and we would not expect too many areas to be frosted in early December. So that's a real outlier of having a susceptible stage right outside the frost period. So that's the first one, and we showed last year if we have sometimes barley with its early maturity can actually be fully through its growth stage before it gets the bad frosts. And we occasionally see that we can have barley that's very early maturing, let's say in August, for example, when there's more rainfall, more cloudy nights, and we can get away with it. It's more rare, but it does happen.
So moving on to the second point, what else was in the objectives?
The second objective is to understand the role of ice-nucleating bacteria and to reduce that impact as much as we can. So there are some things like stubble retention that we would love to do on green zones and amber zones, but on a red zone, retaining stubble is a haven for ice-nucleating bacteria and increases our risk. So we might do something to bury or remove or have less stubble in a red zone, whereas we want to keep it all in a green zone. We also have tried treatments, so application of treatments that actually would inhibit or kill the bacteria, but we haven't had a lot of success in this project. And really that's because we had a -9 degree at canopy height frost, that overcame basically anything that we did. And that followed the previous 2 nights, which were -3 and -4. So these topical treatments, even though there is some evidence that they're useful, there's a degree at which they are valuable, and when we get extremely frosty conditions, we're not having success with them so far.
Mick, what about different types of cereals?
One way of mitigating the risk of frost is to say, well, if I do get frosted, can I still make a viable alternative from a frosted crop? Now, that could be setting it up for grazing for those that have livestock, or it could be saying I can cut that for hay and it needs to have high value, either to retain for my own use or potentially to sell into the domestic or international markets. So the best way of doing it, because we don't know if we're going to be frosted, is to have a wheat or a barley or an oat that can be harvested for grain and have suitable yield and quality, or be cut for hay or be grazed. So we call them dual purpose because we put them in at the start of the year not knowing at the end of the year whether we are going to actually have them as a grain crop or potentially as a hay crop.
Mick, what else did you test?
We had a look at using the seed that was frosted the previous year. Did it actually impact by sowing that seed? So we're looking at 2 effects. And I will say you couldn't tell this grain was being frosted the previous year. The frost was extremely late, and we were able to compare frosted and unfrosted seed that we sowed. So there's 2 potential impacts of that. One is, does it affect the early vigour and ultimately the yield of the crop? And the second is, can we carry ice-nucleating bacteria over internally in that seed from one year to the next? Due to restrictions that we had with being able to test, I don't think we've got a satisfactory answer to the second part of that, but we certainly saw an impact of vigour from sowing frosted seed, both in wheat and barley. And there was a difference between the varieties in terms of the amount of suppression of early growth there was due to that frost.
What else did you look at, Mick?
We've talked about ice-nucleating activity, which is caused by ice-nucleating bacteria. And in our farming systems, there are a few causes of ice-nucleation, but the majority are caused by bacteria, and the majority of those bacteria are Pseudomonas syringae. So we're concentrating on that particular bacteria as an indicator of the amount of frost damage we may get. And we're working closely with Emmanuel Bakuma in Western Australia and his team on some of the things we're doing. And we're monitoring the bacteria levels and the ice-nucleating activity of those bacteria through the season.
What about other things like sowing dates and canopy sizes?
When we look at sowing dates, that's wrapped up in what we call phenology. So when is the plant going to be at a susceptible stage? And one of the things we've done historically is said, perhaps I can avoid frost by being a little bit later in, let's say, flowering. And the traditional way of doing that was actually to sow later. Use the same variety that we might be using in a green zone, but just sow the red zone later. That comes with its own cost, especially in the mid-north, which has a cold environment that the crops don't grow very well, and then spring comes along and they don't have a lot of biomass. So we're saying, hang on a bit, let's look at sowing earlier, but changing the style and the type of crop we grow. So don't have something that's temperature sensitive, have something that's triggered by the length of the day or what we call vernalisation, the cold period. So working the opposite, sow early, but change the variety to have something that's triggered by vernalisation or length of the day.
Mick, you've alluded to some of the key findings already, particularly about the zones and putting the right variety in the right zones. What are some of the other key findings?
I think we can say pretty well that the old rough rule that oats is more tolerant than barley is more tolerant than wheat, I think that holds fairly true. But the problem is that it's limited in that if we get a frost during grain filling of barley, it can be just as damaging as one that's happening at head emergence or flowering of wheat. And because we can't pick when that frost is occurring, then often in the mid-north that barley can be, even though it's more frost tolerant, we don't lose as much yield, but we have a product that we can't sell because it affects the quality of the barley. Oats is more tolerant again as grain, but in some of these environments, it's actually more sensitive to stem frost, and that stem frost has a close association with the Pseudomonas syringae. So we're looking at saying, hang on, if we're going to grow oats, then we certainly wouldn't grow oats on oats the previous year, and we would reduce the amount of stubble, if we could, that we would put an oat crop into.
What about soil types? Did you find anything in regards to that?
I think what we found last year was difficult because last year was a drought. So the drought impact was very, very strong. And I think the effect of drought was more aligned to soil type than the effect of frost was. So I think last year I couldn't say that there was any association with soil type, but it also proved that frost occurs irrespective of the season. So last year there was a lot of frost damage. We had a drought year. In many years we have a high production year like 2022, and some people lost 90% of their crop. So frost is not discriminating in a good year or a bad year. It just means that in a good year, more likely than not, we're having more rain and more cloud and more wind in spring and having less frost events. But if we actually get one, we can actually lose more than we do in a drought year. The worst combination is probably what we got last year, and that is drought and frost that occurred in the same year.
And I guess that feeds into the general state of plant health, stressed plants.
Yeah, and we're not able to determine at this stage, well, from this project, that there was any particular plant health that impacted on frost, but we certainly could see that the combination of high seeding rates and high nitrogen rates had lower temperature above the canopy and resulted in more frost damage. But we can't say whether that was nitrogen or whether it was the plant population.
Mick, you've gathered a lot of knowledge in this project, and an important part of SA Drought Hub's mandate is the extension of knowledge. So how are you getting that out to growers in your region?
Prior to the project, we actually had a workshop with Kate Burke from Victoria, and we only invited to that those people who are severely affected by frost. And it was interesting to note that a lot of those people that attended, firstly, there were couples from the same farm business, and second, we hadn't seen them at a lot of frost events because frost damn well hurts, and quite often they're living in their own little world when frost occurs without the ability or someone to share the pain with, because it happens overnight. Whereas drought, I think in a lot of ways we get used to it as we go through the season and we're not getting the rain. It's more of a shared community thing, whereas we found that frost wasn't a shared community thing. It was very much individual. So we've concentrated on those people who have a lot of red zone as a percentage of their farm, and we ran field days. So we had 3 days where we had farmers and advisors. We also assisted the Upper North farming systems with our knowledge from previous project and what we were doing to take some of our knowledge to some of their field days. And then we reported the results at the annual updates at the Mid-North High Rainfall Zone meeting earlier this year.
Mick, what's your key take-home message to give to people when thinking about improving frost resilience?
The key take-home message is there isn't one single message that will solve a frost problem. It's complex. You have to work within the business. So we tend to say, let's work with the people who are frosted the worst and try and help them by picking up a little bit of red zone versus green zone. What can we do on the red zone? And so for some people, it will be perhaps an emphasis on hay because they have a hay business. They have the sheds and they have the contacts and the machinery. For other people who don't have a hay business, it's a lot more difficult. And so we might say, well, in some cases, don't crop that area. Run livestock on it because your risk is too high. For someone else, it might be, well, let's take a punt with a little more barley if it's suited. Another one is if we do have a hay area, be careful of the chemicals we use because we don't want to rule ourselves out of a potential market because we have residues in that hay that we can't sell because of those residues. So they might change their whole herbicide and fungicide program for a crop on their red zones. They might do it completely different to what they would do on their green zone.
Mick, there's been some great insights. There's also a number of questions hanging. Where to from here?
Probably the thing we're missing at the moment, Drew, with frost in South Australia is we need to concentrate on extension. And my fear about that is if it's just about extension, then we've failed, because last year there was so much frost damage. So either we're not listening or the extension message isn't backed by good science. And I believe there's still a lot to work with in terms of frost research, and that leads to good extension outcomes. So I would push for that we continue research in the area. We know, for example, that all the dual-purpose cereal work has actually been funded by AgriFutures, and it hasn't been with a frost focus. And so we've probably developed there more slowly than what I would like to see. In terms of some of the bacterial work, I think there's a great opportunity to expand that work with how we might control or influence ice-nucleating bacteria in our system.
Mick, it's been a substantial project to say the least, with some significant findings. For now though, Mick Faulkner from AgriLink and also a member of the Mid-North High Rainfall Zone Farming Systems Group, thank you for taking the time and joining me for this SA Drought Hub podcast.
Thanks, Drew. I hope it's of benefit for those farmers who do have frost as an issue. And I don't mind if those people that are all green zone just ignore everything, because we don't want them to do anything for frost if it's not affecting them.
And that concludes this podcast. You'll find more podcasts on the SA Drought Hub website at sadroughthub.com.au. The South Australian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub is one of 8 hubs established across the nation through the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. The SA Drought Hub is an exciting initiative which brings together a dynamic network of primary producers, industry groups, researchers, government agencies, universities, agribusinesses, farming systems groups, traditional owners and others to work towards a common vision to strengthen the drought resilience and preparedness of farms and regional communities in SA. Led by the University of Adelaide in partnership with the Department of Primary Industries and Regions South Australia, the hub is responsible for driving the extension of existing knowledge and practices to build drought resilience in primary production systems. Any recommendations, suggestions or opinions contained in this publication do not necessarily represent the policy or views of the South Australian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub, SA Drought Hub. No person should act on the basis of the contents of this publication without first obtaining specific, independent professional advice. The SA Drought Hub and contributors to this publication may identify products by proprietary or trade names to help readers identify particular types of products. The Hub does not endorse or recommend the products of any manufacturer referred to. Other products may perform as well as or better than those specifically referred to. The SA Drought Hub will not be liable for any loss, damage, cost or expense incurred or arising by reason of any person using or relying on the information in this publication.